The wind hissed against the shuttered windows of a lonely September deep in the heart of the city once called the soul of the Seven's realm. The distant clang of metal on metal echoed through winding alleyways. Torchlight flickered against damp cobblestones, and the thin shapes of small folk hurried to find shelter before curfew fell. It was a tumultuous time. Rarely had the faithful felt so uncertain. Rarely had the once common devotions seemed so rife with doubt. An undercurrent of fear ran through King's Landing, though many would not name it fear but reverence, or perhaps dread. The men who patrolled the streets in plain robes bore a fanatical gleam in their eyes, brandishing cudgels where once only knights in shining plate had marched. They called themselves Sparrows. They claimed to raise the banner of the Seven. Yet beyond the city walls, rumors abounded that their dogma had been shaped not solely by the teachings of the seven-pointed star, but by a lost faith in R'hllor, the Lord of Light, whose flame once flickered across the narrow sea and now seemed to burn in the hidden corners of Westeros, fueling new convictions and new ambitions. Across the city's labyrinth of curved streets and hidden squares, a figure walked cloaked in thick wool. This traveler's boots were thick with dried mud, and the pallor of her face hinted at long nights of watchfulness rather than restful slumber. Though she carried no heraldic sigil, something about her countenance suggested she was neither common nor entirely foreign to nobility. Beneath the hood, she was a woman with deep green eyes and faint scars upon her left cheek, the legacy of an encounter with outlaws near Crackclaw Point. She had once shared a road with red priests on the run from the west. She had listened to their prayers, half in curiosity, half in fear. Now she had come here, King's Landing in chaos, to search for what truth lay behind this new force that called itself the Sparrows. No one looked twice at her. There were too many strangers in the city these days. Refugees from the Riverlands, pilgrims from the countryside, merchants seeking profit in uncertain times. She slipped into the gloom like a moth sliding around the edges of a lantern's glow. The figure's name was Alyssa Harroway, born of a lesser branch of House Harroway with no great claim to land or wealth. She had grown up hearing tales of how her forebears once held power in the Riverlands, of how they had lost everything through pride and misfortune. In the final days of her father's life, she had found herself forced to wander the roads, making do with what coin she could scrounge. Her father's old illusions of grandeur had collapsed like a mud wall in a thunderstorm, and with them had gone her illusions of a stable world. Her curiosity about faith, whether the old gods of the north, the Seven of the south, or R'hllor in the east, had grown from necessity. Faith might guide a lost traveler, she'd thought. Faith might console a lonely heart. Yet what she discovered as she wandered the Crownlands was far from reassuring. Faith seemed as mutable as the wind, shaped by men and women who claimed the gods for their own ends. Word had reached her ears of a new movement in the capital, those so-called Sparrows who had begun to enforce what they called true devotion to the Seven. But behind that movement, there were whispers of an older flame, something borrowed from the red priests whose teachings glowed like coals, full of mesmerizing promises of rebirth through fire and atonement through sacrifice. Some said the High Sparrow himself had once knelt at an altar of R'hllor and found it wanting. Others believed a small sect of R'hlloress exiles had quietly joined the faith, twisting the fundamental doctrines. The rumor that seized hold of Alyssa, however, was that the newly ascendant faction of Sparrows had a deeper political game in mind, one that would shape the struggle for power in the capital more than any other. She stepped beneath an overhang. There, she surveyed a scene that spoke volumes about the city's changing heart. Two novice Sparrows stood watch outside a ramshackle door, each with shaved heads and patched robes that gave them a humble mien, but the wooden cudgels at their belts said otherwise. A pair of street children stood across the way, peering with wide eyes, as if waiting for scraps of bread or for a chance to run an errand. The novices were engaged in low conversation. Occasionally, one of them gestured to the door, then to the road, as if anticipating someone's arrival. Alyssa knew that behind that door was a common hall turned worship space, where ordinary folk gathered to hear sermons each evening. She had heard the far-off chanting once and recognized some words from the seven-pointed star, but also the strident, fiery language that the red priests favored. Yet they did not speak openly of R'hllor in these gatherings. They invoked the Seven, calling upon the Father's judgment, the mother's mercy, the warrior's strength. But occasionally, she caught the mention of the cleansing flame or the night that must be driven back by faith. To Alyssa, that smacked of red priest rhetoric. She had once witnessed a Lawler ceremony in Volantis, full of chanting and the swirl of flames. But that was far across the sea. Westeros had always favored the Seven, the old gods, or, in the Iron Islands, the drowned god. Lawler was an Eastern creed, though it had found footholds here and there, especially in times of strife. Now it seemed the candle flame of Lawleress worship had seeped into the faith of the Seven, or at least into the hearts of some. So had the Sparrows truly arisen from a lost faith in Lawler? Or were the rumors that they perverted the Seven's teachings for political gain mere scaremongering? Perhaps the truth lay somewhere in the space between. Alyssa Haraway resolved to find that truth for herself. She had come to the city not as a pilgrim, but as a woman searching for answers to her own tangled past. She carried a ring that once belonged to her father, a single ruby set in silver. Sometimes the gem seemed to catch the light and glow, though it might only have been the trick of a street lamp. Still, she had grown cautious ever since an old merchant recognized the ring for what it was, a trinket brought from the east. He had asked if her father had dealings with the Red Priests, and she said she did not know. But she had begun to wonder if, in his final days, her father had placed his faith in Lawler, imagining the Lord of Light might deliver him from the injustices that had befallen House Haraway. "I must see for myself," she murmured beneath her hood. A slow drizzle had begun to fall, pattering on the slate rooftops. The novices outside the door shifted uneasily. One sneezed. The other rubbed his shaved head with a shiver. The night was damp, the city's stale heat mingling with the persistent chill of early spring. With a steadying breath, Alyssa approached them, shoulders bowed in a gesture of humility. "Good evening," she said in a soft voice. She kept her gaze low, taking care not to appear challenging. She had been observing them long enough to know these novices were not the worst of the so-called faithful. They were younger, new to their calling, more uncertain. "What is your business?" asked one. He had a pockmarked face, the remains of childhood illness, and eyes that looked too old for his teenage years. "I have come to hear tonight's sermon," she replied. "I have walked far and would like to rest among the faithful." The novices exchanged glances. The pockmarked one frowned. "You come at a late hour. Are you truly a devotee, or do you come seeking gossip? We do not permit idlers." "I seek the Seven's grace," she said earnestly. "I seek redemption. I have sinned. Is that not the purpose of these gatherings, that all sinners might find the path to atonement?" The second novice, a tall, gaunt boy with a faint beard, studied her. "We do not bar sinners," he said, "but we cast out liars." "I have no lies," she replied, forcing her voice to tremble a little. "Please let me join. If it is not to be, I will find another place." She allowed a quaver of desperation to creep in, recalling the many nights she had learned to feign the helplessness that made men drop their guard. They measured her for a moment longer. At last, the gaunt one nodded. "Very well, but make no trouble. The faith is weary of those who come to spy for the lords and ladies who fear our righteous cause." Alyssa bowed her head again. "I am but a penitent." With that, they opened the old door. The smell of melted tallow candles wafted out along with the chatter of voices reciting prayers. She stepped inside. The novices followed, closing the door behind her. The hall was a cramped and dilapidated space, once used for storing grain. The walls still bore stains where barrels had leaked. Yet crude benches had been dragged in, rows of them facing a makeshift altar. Hanging behind that altar was a rough-hewn symbol, the seven-pointed star etched into wood, but with each arm of the star traced over with red paint. An odd detail, Alyssa thought, as if the star had been scrawled in blood or tinted flame. Dozens of people sat on the benches, clutching each other's hands, heads bowed. Most wore clothes patched and threadbare, men and women alike. They looked more like beggars than wealthy worshippers. They listened to a speaker who stood before the wooden star, an older man with a stooped back and a quill-thin nose. His robes were nondescript, but there was a severity in his features. He was not the High Sparrow, Alyssa realized. He must be one of the new septons that the Sparrows had installed. She had heard that they replaced the old hierarchy with humble, self-ordained holy men, each determined to root out sin wherever it might be found. Sin is not a solitary matter, the older man intoned. His voice had a resonant quality that belied his frail body. We sin together, and so we must be cleansed together. We sin in the darkness, and so we must bring light to drive that darkness away. Some worshippers nodded. Others murmured, "Yes, Septon." The older man raised his voice further. "The seven speak through me, yes, but not because I am worthy. I am unworthy as all men are unworthy. Rather, the seven shine a light within my soul, so that I might see what must be done. Some speak of a single flame in the night, the flame that purges all unclean things. Do they speak of heresy, or do they speak in tongues that the righteous can interpret? I tell you, the darkness cannot stand before the fire of our devotion." His voice boomed at the end, spittle flying from his lips. It was a rhetoric Alyssa had heard among those who followed the Red God, shaped now to fit the faithful of the seven. She carefully took a seat on a bench near the back, drawing her cloak closer. The novices who had escorted her in stood near the walls, watching. The septon moved his hands in an arc, as though conjuring an invisible presence. "We must not fear. We must not waver. The illusions of gold and silver, the vanities of lords and ladies, these are the temptations that lead us into shadow. But we have a higher calling. Ours is to shape the kingdom anew. Ours is to cast away the corruption that has gnawed at Westeros for generations." Murmurs of agreement rumbled through the crowd. Alyssa heard a woman weeping softly, and a man whispering comfort to her. The septon seized upon that moment. Yes, tears are the first step to purification. Through tears we accept our frailty. Through tears we wash away the crust of pride. But tears alone are not enough. We must stand strong. We must see that the faithful are united, that those who cling to old sins or foreign heresies are guided to the righteous path. He paused, breath quavering, and his gaze roamed the crowd, landing momentarily on Alyssa. She felt a frisson of tension. Did he sense a stranger's presence, or was he simply scanning the faithful for signs of doubt? With a soft exhale, he continued, "Go forth tonight, each of you, and remember that no difference stands between highborn and low. All must kneel to the seven. All must burn away the illusions that keep us from our shared destiny. The High Sparrow calls upon us to be beacons in the gloom. He calls upon us to cast down the proud. Hear his words through me, and carry them in your hearts. The night grows dark, yet the seven's flame endures." He raised a hand in benediction. "Go now in peace and in vigilance." The congregation began to stir. People rose from the benches, some approaching the septon to murmur confessions or ask for blessings. Others trickled out. Alyssa remained seated, watching, waiting for a chance to approach the man in private, or at least to glean more knowledge from the whispers around him. One by one, the faithful departed. The novices near the door allowed them to exit, though they seemed to watch for any sign of trouble. Finally, the hall nearly emptied. Alyssa was the last to rise, and she steeled herself to meet the septon. She had to appear earnest, a woman seeking redemption. She approached him as he snuffed out a few candles near the altar. Up close, she noticed how his robed arms were wiry with muscle, how his face bore the scars of an old wound near his temple. This was a man who had seen violence. "Septon," she said softly, eyes lowered, "your sermon moved me. I have come a great distance, seeking to mend my sins." He did not turn at first. He blew out another candle, leaving the room lit only by a lantern in the corner. At last he faced her. "What sins, child?" Alyssa swallowed. "I gave myself to false gods," she said, letting just enough tremor into her voice. "I strayed from the path of the seven. I did not know if I could ever be forgiven. Yet your words tonight spoke of hope. Might I beg the chance to speak with you, that I might find absolution." He studied her, his brow knitted. "False gods, you say? Where did you first encounter them? In my wanderings, she replied. East of here, beyond the seas. I saw a great red temple once, and I listened to their talk of a single flame. Something about it drew me, as though the darkness within me yearned for any promise of light. I am ashamed of my curiosity now. The corners of his mouth tightened. And do you still yearn for that flame? She shook her head vehemently. No, Septon. I yearn for the Seven's mercy. But I fear that my soul carries the stain of that heresy. He was silent for a long moment, measuring her words. Then he let out a slow, quiet breath. What is your name? Annette, Septon? She lied, picking a name that was unremarkable. He nodded, as if rolling the name in his mind. Annette, all souls can be cleansed. The Seven do not abandon their children forever, nor does the High Sparrow cast aside a penitent heart. But you must prove your sincerity. Will you? She bowed her head. I will. He lifted a finger. Not here. The novices will lock this place soon. Walk with me, child. We shall speak as we go. The night is dark, but the Seven watch over us. Alyssa felt a swell of tension. She had not expected to be invited to walk with him, yet this might be the chance she needed to learn more. As you say, she acquiesced. They left the hall together, stepping out into the damp alley. The novices nodded respectfully to the Septon. Then, as they departed, one of the novices swung the door shut with a heavy thud and bolted it. The city's gloom closed around them. A lamp glowed at the far end of the alley, barely illuminating the shapes of the tall, worn buildings. The Septon led her out onto a broader street, uneven cobblestones slick with rain. His voice was low as they walked. Tell me what you know of the Red God. Alyssa's mind raced. She had gleaned enough in her travels to speak convincingly, but she had to be careful. They speak of the Lord of Light, who wages an eternal war against darkness. They say that all other gods are false, that only the flame can reveal truth. They claim to see visions in the fire, prophecies that guide them. He gave a grunt of distaste. Prophecies, indeed. I have heard such things too. They swirl in from the east like a plague of locusts, devouring gullible hearts. She let her voice tremble again. I was one such heart, but I realized that what they promise is too absolute. Only the Seven can truly guide us in this mortal life. They passed a pair of city watchmen on the corner, who wore plain metal caps and carried spears. The watchman eyed the Septon and Alyssa but made no move. In times past, city guards might have questioned a robed zealot wandering at night, but the power dynamic had changed. Many among the faith militant worked hand in hand with the watch now, especially since the crown had grown wary of stirring conflict with the High Sparrow. The pair pressed on unimpeded. The Septon's footsteps seemed sure, even in the slick streets. Annette, do you know what the Red Priests do to those who resist them in the East? She shook her head, feigning ignorance. I have heard tales of burnings, but rumors spread so quickly. He spat onto the ground, a gesture of disgust. They burn men alive for not bowing to their so-called Lord of Light. They brand them heretics, unbelievers, as if the entire world must yield to one single flame. Yes, they are fanatics, and if we allow them to fester here, they will take root like a weed. The High Sparrow knows this, as do I. But the common folk? Some fall easily to the allure of a fiery god. Perhaps it seems more tangible than the subtlety of the Seven. It must be uprooted. Annette. Lawler has no place in Westeros. Alyssa watched him carefully as they rounded a corner. I have heard that the new movement in the faith, the Sparrows, has introduced teachings about cleansing flame, she murmured quietly. Is that not a sign that some among them look to Lawler's example? He shot her a sharp look. You speak boldly. Mind your tongue. The cleansing flame we speak of is the righteous fury of the Seven, the divine wrath. It is not the Eastern heresy. The similarities are but superficial. Her heart pounded at his vehemence. Forgive me, Septon. I only wish to be sure. He exhaled, tension in his shoulders. We are not the Red God's pawns, if that's what you imply. We are men and women of the Seven, purified of corruption. Yet I will not deny that some among us once looked east for answers. The times have been dark indeed. But even if a soul once prayed to the foreign flame, that does not mean it cannot return to the true path. The High Sparrow takes the lost and broken, shapes them anew in the Seven's image. She thought carefully on how to respond. So the rumors that the Sparrows arose from disillusioned worshippers of R'hllor, are they entirely false? He paused in his stride, turning to face her beneath the faint glow of a guttering lantern. The rain had slowed to a thin drizzle, and droplets glimmered on his brow. Many rumors swirl in these troubled times, some half-truths, some entire lies. Let me be clear, child. If there are any who were once enthralled by the Red God, they have been reborn to the Seven's cause. The High Sparrow's movement does not serve foreign masters. We do not twist belief for political gain, as some whisper. We are a pure expression of the Seven's will. Do you understand? She nodded slowly. I do. But in her mind doubts churned. Was this man telling the whole truth? Or was he simply the mouthpiece of a carefully constructed narrative? She recalled the fervor in his sermon, the tang of red paint on the seven-pointed star, the allusions to fire driving away the night. It was all too similar to the R'hllor worship she had witnessed. Perhaps the Septon's words represented the official stance, while behind the scenes, those with ties to the Lord of Light shaped the rhetoric in subtle ways. They resumed walking, the Septon silent for a time. When they emerged from the narrower streets into a broader thoroughfare, Alyssa glimpsed the looming shape of the great September in the distance, though in these unsettled days it seemed less majestic than in the past, overshadowed by the swirl of rumors and the presence of the fanatical faith militant in the city. A group of common folk trudged past, carrying sacks of what looked like turnips. A woman cast a wary glance at the Septon, dipping her head in a curt bow before hastening on. The city had become a place of hush and fear, overshadowed by a new brand of fervor. Alyssa could practically feel the tension in the damp air. Finally, the Septon halted. They stood at a small intersection, near the base of a crumbling statue that might once have depicted the maiden. The statue's features were eroded beyond recognition. He looked at Alyssa gravely. I sense a thirst in you for knowledge, Annette. But remember that knowledge can lead to pride, and pride leads to sin. If you truly wish to atone, you must humble yourself before the Seven, not question the shape of their flame. She lowered her gaze. I understand, Septon, but I must confess, I still feel doubt. Perhaps doubt in my own worthiness. I have so many questions about how these beliefs can coexist. Does the High Sparrow himself speak of the Eastern Flame? He bristled, but there was a note of empathy in his eyes. You are a penitent. I should not expect your every thought to be in perfect alignment with the faith. The High Sparrow is the voice of the Seven in these troubled times. He does not speak of the Eastern Flame, not in the way you suggest, but he will speak of cleansing, of purifying fires that can purge the kingdom of sin. Yes, some might think it reminiscent of that heresy. In truth, it is only the righteous path. Men fear the flames, but you must not. The Seven's fires burn away falsehood, leaving behind only truth. He lifted a hand in a gesture that might have been intended to reassure, though it only deepened Alyssa's unease. Return here tomorrow evening if your heart compels you. Another sermon will be held. The novices can guide you further on the path to absolution. For now, I must go. And with that, he turned away, the tail of his robe catching the rain-slick street as he headed toward the great September. Alyssa stood there a moment, watching him vanish into the darkness. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Then, drawing her cloak tight, she slipped down a side street, determined to find shelter before the watchful eyes of the Sparrows took renewed notice of her. That night, Alyssa found a spot to sleep in a dingy inn on the outskirts of Flea Bottom. She had enough coin for a cramped room that smelled of old ale and onion stew. The innkeeper was a dour woman who seldom spoke but demanded payment up front. Alyssa handed over a few coppers, grateful to have a solid roof over her head for once. She lay on the thin straw mattress, listening to the muffled clamor from below, the occasional curses from a drunk occupant in the corridor, and the scuttling of rats behind the walls. Sleep came in fits. She dreamed of fire, of a bright light sweeping over fields of bones. She dreamed of a red priest she had once seen, chanting in a language she did not understand, beckoning her to join him in the flames. Then the dream shifted, and she saw the high sparrow's face, though it was not truly his face, but an amalgam of 100 stooped men wearing the same pitiless expression. They reached out to her with hands of flame, whispering that she must burn to be saved. She awoke in the early hours, heart pounding. For a moment, she lay still, breathing in the stale air. Outside, the city was quiet but for the distant watch calls and the scurrying footsteps of vagrants. Thoughts swirled in her mind. The uneasy similarity between the faith of R'hllor and the new brand of fanaticism in the capital. She remembered the question that had originally drawn her here. Had the Sparrows truly arisen from a lost faith in R'hllor, twisting belief for political gain? Perhaps the question was more complex than a simple yes or no. Maybe, in the chaos of war and famine, in the upheaval of dynastic conflicts, men and women sought any flame that might guide them, be it the Sevens or R'hlloress. Somewhere along the way, those flames might have intertwined, forging a new zealotry that used the trappings of the Seven but carried an Eastern edge. Yet questions nagged at her more personally. Did her father truly place his last hopes in the Lord of Light, or was that just rumor? The ring on her finger felt cold, the ruby dull in the gloom. She turned it around and around, eventually closing her eyes to catch what rest she could before the dawn. Morning came with the bleary shuffle of the inn's inhabitants. Alyssa rose, touched her boots to check for any missing belongings, and found them intact. Downstairs, she bought a crust of bread and a cup of weak ale, then ventured out into the city's pale sunlight. A thin fog drifted through King's Landing, blending with the smoke from cook fires and blacksmiths' forges. Her plan for the day was simple: glean more information, speak to those who might have personal ties to the Red Priests. If the rumor was true, that some within the Sparrows once believed in R'hllor, surely there were individuals who remembered. Perhaps an exiled Red Priest who lurked among the refugees, or a local who once felt the lure of the foreign faith. She wandered flea bottom with her hood up, eavesdropping on street corner chatter, seeking any mention of R'hllor or the Lord of Light. Most folk were more concerned with the rising prices of bread, or the latest rumor about which highborn lady had fallen from grace under the Sparrow's watch. A handful whispered of the High Sparrow's demands on the crown, or the rumored punishments meted out to those who refused to confess their sins. But no one spoke openly of the Red God. At midday, she ventured to a dilapidated courtyard near the old dragon pit, where a friend of a friend had told her a Red Priest might occasionally appear to preach. The courtyard was mostly empty. A few tired souls huddled near a corner, warming themselves around a brazier. She listened from a distance but heard nothing of significance. She was about to give up and leave when a voice, raspy and low, called out to her from under an archway. "You there, girl? Why linger?" Alyssa turned to see a stooped woman, face half hidden by greasy strands of hair. The lines on her cheeks suggested she was older than her posture hinted. She wore rags but had a proud set to her jaw, a contradiction of manner and appearance. "I'm just passing," Alyssa said evenly. "Do you want coin?" The woman snorted. "Coin helps little in these times. Men who claim to serve the Seven grow bolder every day, beating us if we do not say the right prayers. And men who spoke of a single flame, they vanish into the shadows, or else they walk among the faith, wearing new garments." Alyssa's pulse quickened. She stepped closer. "What do you mean by that?" The woman's eyes flicked left and right, as though fearful of eavesdroppers. "I once saw a Red Priest years ago, preaching near this very spot. And I saw him again not long past, wearing the robes of a sparrow. He had shaved his head, but his eyes burned with that same fervor. I know him. I'd stake my life on it." Alyssa swallowed hard. "Are you certain?" The woman sneered. "My wits might be frayed, girl, but I know a man's face. Oh, he was changed, yes, but not enough to fool me. He used to speak of the Lord of Light, how all darkness must be burned away. Now he speaks of the 7 scouring fires. Different words, same message. It was exactly the kind of confirmation Alyssa had sought. She studied the woman's face, seeing no hint of deception, only a bitterness that might come from being cast aside by every new wave of zealotry. "Why would he switch faiths?" she asked softly. "Because times change. Perhaps he saw that the red god was too foreign. He realized that men would more readily follow the seven, especially if he used their fear of moral corruption. The War of the Five Kings left many hungry, many broken. People want a reason, a scapegoat, an easy path to salvation. So these sparrows claim it. But the message is no different than Rulalaress. Purge the unclean. Burn away the shadow. All that changes is the name they give their deity." Alyssa felt a chill that had nothing to do with the fog. "Have you told this to anyone else?" The woman barked a laugh, harsh and humorless. "I might as well proclaim it on the steps of the Great September. No one listens. And if the sparrows hear, they'll call me a heretic and lock me up for slandering their piety. I am nobody with no house or shield. My words carry no weight. Best I keep them to myself, or share them only when I smell a coin might be had." Alyssa reached into her cloak and pressed a small coin into the woman's hand. "Thank you," she said. "What is your name?" The woman eyed the coin greedily, then tucked it into the folds of her ragged attire. "Call me Etta. That's all you need to know." With that, she turned away, as though the conversation had never happened. Alyssa stood there a moment longer, grappling with the realization that the rumors had some truth. Some former red priests had indeed joined the Sparrows, perhaps out of disillusionment with Rulalaress' unfulfilled promises, or perhaps out of a shrewder desire for power in the rising movement of the faith militant. It begged the question, was the High Sparrow himself aware of this infiltration? Or did he think these men and women were simply converts, reformed sinners who had found the path of the seven? Perhaps in his quest to rid Westeros of corruption, he had overlooked the seeds of a foreign creed that might eventually consume them all. Or maybe he welcomed it, believing that the fervor of Exarchiller worshippers would fortify the faith's crusade. If the High Sparrow wanted to reform the realm by force, who better to enlist than those who already believed in fire and blood as a path to purification? Uncertain, Alyssa slipped away from the courtyard, her head spinning with possibilities. She made her way to a quieter alley, sat on a broken barrel, and turned the ruby ring on her finger. Could this be the same path her father had trod, wandering from one faith to another, seeking a power strong enough to restore his fortunes? She found herself despising both forms of fanaticism. She pictured the men in plain robes, hands calloused around clubs, echoing the same phrases she'd heard from the red priests in Volantis. All men must be cleansed. The night is dark, but the fire burns brighter. Salvation through suffering. The Seven's creed, as far as she had known it, was gentler, focused on the family of gods who oversaw different facets of mortal life, calling for compassion and justice. This new incarnation, spearheaded by the Sparrows, had become something else altogether, something that reeked of Eastern fervor. She remembered the Septon's words from the previous night. "We are not the Red God's pawns. We do not twist belief for political gain." Yet was that not precisely what some of them were doing? Alyssa thought of the men in power, those who might be using this new movement to manipulate the throne or wrest concessions from lords and ladies. People in high places always found a way to turn religion into a tool for their own devices. Perhaps the question was not about whether the Sparrows had arisen from a lost faith in Rulalar, twisting belief for political gain, but rather how thoroughly they had integrated the Red God's ideology into their own. Alyssa took a deep breath. She decided she needed a closer look at how the Sparrows truly operated behind the scenes. Attending open sermons was one thing, but the real truth would be found among those who enforced the High Sparrow's will. She intended to witness their actions firsthand. Perhaps she could follow them, watch them deal with sinners, and see if their brand of purification matched the foreign brutality she associated with Rulalar. That afternoon, she loitered near the Great September, under the pretense of a pilgrim waiting to pray. She kept her hood low, face concealed, and discreetly observed a group of armed faith militant who congregated around the plaza. These men wore plain robes, but beneath were boiled leathers. Some had the seven-pointed star carved into their flesh on the forehead, a mark of zealotry. Others carried cudgels or swords with star-shaped pommels. They looked formidable, but more than that, they looked determined. There was a fanatic light in their eyes, one she had seen in the east among the Red Priest's acolytes. As the hours stretched on, she noticed the group receiving orders from a lean sparrow with narrow eyes. He spoke in low tones, scanning a piece of parchment that might list names or addresses. Then the group split up, heading off in different directions. Alyssa decided to shadow one contingent. She followed at a safe distance, blending with the crowd, using side streets to stay unnoticed. The handful of sparrows eventually arrived at a modest residence. They surrounded the door, knocked loudly, and demanded entry. When a frail-looking man opened the door, they barged in, citing suspicion of immoral conduct. Alyssa's heart thudded as she crept closer, listening from outside a half-open window. "What is the meaning of this?" the man inside asked, voice quavering. "I have done nothing wrong. Rumor says you harbor a whore within these walls. A woman you have not married, who sells her body for coin," said one of the sparrows. "That is a sin. We are here to deliver the Seven's justice." The man stammered. My sister's daughter is ill, she cannot." "Do not lie to us," barked another sparrow. "Where is she?" There was a scuffle, a cry from somewhere deeper in the house. Alyssa wanted to look away but forced herself to keep listening. She heard the woman's sobs. Then the lead sparrow commanded, "Seize her. She will face trial at the September." "No, please," the man pleaded, his voice choked with desperation. "She is but a poor girl, forced into whoredom by hunger. There is no sin in that." "Sin is sin," said the sparrow, pitiless. "She must confess, repent, and be judged." There was a sound of struggle, footsteps trampling over furniture. The woman's weeping intensified, then receded as they dragged her out. Alyssa pressed herself against the outer wall. She saw the door burst open, and the sparrows emerged, the young woman in tow. She looked to be no more than 17, her face contorted with terror. The lead sparrow kicked the door shut behind him with a grim finality. The girl sobbed, "I have not sinned, I only—" The sparrow backhanded her across the face. "You dare speak? You have consorted with men, taken their coin for lustful acts. You will confess." Her lips split and blood trickled down her chin. The other men forced her arms behind her back. The older man who had answered the door stumbled out after them, crying, "Stop this cruelty, I beg of you. She is all I have." One of the sparrows shoved him roughly. "Interfere, and you'll be judged as well." He fell to the ground, tears mixing with the dust. "Please have mercy," he rasped. The lead sparrow glared at him. "There is mercy in confession. She will have her chance before the September. She can repent. That is more mercy than the realm once offered whores." With that, they marched off, the woman in tow. The older man tried to follow, but two sparrows pushed him back, threatening him with drawn cudgels. Then they vanished into the crowded street, presumably heading for a place of judgment. Alyssa's stomach churned. The cruelty, the conviction. It was exactly the kind of unrelenting zeal she had witnessed among the Red Priests who believed they alone possessed the truth. While the faith had always maintained certain moral strictures, this level of brutality felt like a perversion. She slumped against the wall, letting out a shaky breath as she heard the older man sobbing in the doorway. So the sparrows claimed they had not borrowed from Lawler. They insisted they were purer than the old septons who hobnobbed with the powerful. Yet in her eyes, they were simply a different face of the same merciless coin. Burn away sin, judge the impure, force confessions. She could imagine them lighting a pyre soon enough, if they thought it necessary for purification. She did not know if they had already done so, but the possibility frightened her. She slipped away from that street, though her heart remained heavy. The day stretched on as she wandered the city in a kind of daze, seeing more and more signs of the sparrow's influence. A shopkeeper whipped for selling watered-down wine. A passing woman berated for wearing a gown too fine for her station. Fear had settled like a shroud. People bowed their heads to these robed men, half out of religious piety and half out of dread for what might happen if they did not comply. Late in the afternoon, Alyssa found herself near the mud gate, watching as a caravan of dusty travelers arrived. Among them, to her surprise, was a figure in red robes. A priest of R'hllor? She tensed, expecting an immediate confrontation, but the figure quickly removed the red cloak and stowed it away, revealing plain garb beneath. He melted into the throng, and the city watch paid him no special heed. She wondered what his purpose was in King's Landing and whether he was one of those who still carried R'hllor's faith in his heart. Alyssa followed him, careful to remain at a distance. She almost lost him in the throng, but after a long chase through twisting side streets, she saw him slip into a small stable. She crept to the stable's edge, peering between the boards. Inside, the man stood with another figure, clad in the gray rags of a beggar but carrying himself with a certain poise. She strained to hear their conversation. "The movement grows stronger each day," said the man in the beggar's garb. "They have the city by the throat. Now is the time to sow what we have learned, if we want to steer them." The man in the red robes frowned. "You speak as if they are our pawns, but we must be cautious. The High Sparrow is not easily swayed. He despises anything that smacks of foreign influence. If he suspects we guide him from the shadows, he could turn on us." "Yes," the beggar agreed, "but the seeds are already planted. We gave them the notion of cleansing flame. We taught them to see the world in terms of purging darkness. They do not call it R'hllor's will, but the origin is ours. If they continue down this path, they may serve our ends, driving out false idols and ushering in a new age of devotion, one step at a time. And eventually, they will be open to the truth of the one God." Alyssa felt a jolt of alarm. So it was real, a quiet infiltration, an attempt to shape the Sparrows from within. She forced herself to keep still, hardly daring to breathe. The man in red let out a sigh. "I worry they are more brutal than we intended. We wanted fervor, yes, but not unhinged cruelty. Many innocents suffer under their zeal." The beggar responded with a cynical shrug. "The forging of a new era is never gentle. So long as the flames burn, we can channel them." There was a rustling, and Alyssa ducked lower, afraid she would be spotted. After a few moments, he dared another glimpse. The two men clasped hands, then parted. The man in red left first, slipping out a back entrance. The beggar, or so he appeared, collected a small pouch from the corner, perhaps full of coins or other tokens, and strolled out into the street. Once again, she followed at a careful distance, but the beggar soon vanished amid the bustle of an open-air market. Despite losing him, the conversation remained etched in her mind. It answered, at least in part, the question that had drawn her. Some of the Sparrows had indeed arisen from a lost faith in R'hllor. Or, more accurately, a faction of R'hllor's devotees had found a way to sow their beliefs into the movement of the Sparrows, taking advantage of the kingdom's turmoil to shape a new religious and political force. They had twisted the Seven's message, merging it with the Eastern theology of fire, redemption, and the obliteration of darkness. It was cunning and it was horrifying. That night, Alyssa roamed restlessly. The city felt like a tinderbox. She saw men and women forced to pray in the streets, to confess sins real or imagined. She passed a crowd near the Great September, listening to a robed preacher condemn the licentiousness of the court. She heard tell of knights who once served the crown, now wearing the star upon their surcoats, punishing any who defied the faith. Fear coiled in her gut as she realized how swiftly the movement had grown, how deeply it had sunk its roots. She thought of confronting the High Sparrow with her suspicions, but that would be madness. He might not believe her, or worse, he might see her as an agent of the Red God herself. Her illusions of some mild, reasoned approach to unraveling this threat seemed naive. In the city's charged atmosphere, a whisper of heresy could land a person in the dungeons, or worse. Yet she could not simply slink away. She had come in search of answers about her father's ring, about the question of how R'hllor's faith had seeped into the land. She had found more than she bargained for. The seeds of a new tyranny, masked by the name of the Seven. If it was left unchecked, it could transform Westeros forever. Or perhaps it already had. On the second night, Alyssa returned to the old grain hall to attend the sermon as promised to the Septon. She arrived earlier, when the novices first opened the doors. A knot of believers shuffled in, some wearing blank, fearful expressions, others wearing the rapt devotion of zealots. Alyssa quietly took a seat near the rear, clasping her hands as if in prayer. Tonight's sermon was led by a different speaker, a woman with cropped gray hair and a voice like hammered iron. She wore a loose robe, but her bearing was confident, almost martial. "Brothers and sisters," she began, "we come here in humility, for none of us are free from sin. Yet we must also come in strength, for sin flourishes where righteous men and women show weakness. The crown has failed us. The lords of the realm have failed us. Who, then, shall keep us safe from moral decay? Only we ourselves, guided by the Seven's light." She paced in front of the crude altar, feet tracing a pattern on the creaking boards. "Do you think the darkness in our hearts cares whether we kneel before the Seven or any other god? No, it does not, unless we are willing to stand firm, to let the holy flame burn away our fears, to let the taste of ashes remind us of our mortality. Think on this. The night is long, but the fire can be kindled anew. Will you be part of that kindling?" Alyssa felt a shiver. The parallels to Lawloress rhetoric were stark. The worshippers in the front benches gazed at the speaker with wide-eyed awe, some nodding fervently. The novices near the walls watched everyone closely. Alyssa tried to appear suitably entranced while keeping her mind alert for more clues. The gray-haired speaker's gaze swept the room. "We must also be wary of those who come among us with false hearts, who wish to twist our faith to foreign ways. Know that we root them out. Know that we will not allow the heresies of the East to corrupt us." She paused, eyes narrowing. "But hear this as well. The power of redemption is vast. Even the vilest heretic, if he truly repents and bows to the Seven, can be saved. None are beyond the reach of the Seven's mercy, provided they embrace the cleansing flame." As she spoke, one of the novices stepped forward, holding a brazier with glowing coals. The speaker took a small bundle of incense, casting it on the coals. A bitter, pungent smoke rose, drifting through the cramped hall. Alyssa stifled a cough. The smell was reminiscent of the exotic resins used in the Red Temples. She had encountered them before in her travels. Was this yet another sign of infiltration? Or had the faith militant simply adopted a new ritual for dramatic effect? The sermon ended with a chorus of prayers, the faithful bowing their heads. Alyssa mimicked them, though her mind churned. As the novices ushered people out, she lingered, hoping to speak again with the Septon from the previous night. Instead, the gray-haired speaker approached her. "Why do you remain?" she asked, voice softened yet still resonant. "Do you seek counsel?" Alyssa swallowed hard, inventing a persona once more. "Yes, sister. I am a penitent soul, uncertain of how to find the Seven's grace. Last night, a Septon told me to return here." The woman studied her, sharp-eyed. "Ah, you must mean Septon Ferris. He is not here tonight, but I can offer you guidance. My name is Septa Melina." "Septa Melina," Alyssa repeated, bowing slightly. "Thank you. I wonder if the Seven might ever forgive one who once dabbled in foreign rites." The Septa's face flickered with curiosity. "So that is your burden. Then you must be prepared to cast aside any lingering doubt or affection for that foreign creed. The Seven can forgive, but only if your repentance is absolute." Alyssa nodded. "Of course. I only worry that the mark of that heresy might linger in my soul." Melina's gaze turned thoughtful. "The mark does not vanish easily. Sometimes it requires penance. Sometimes a soul must endure trials to prove itself worthy. Are you willing to endure trials, child?" Alyssa suppressed a shiver. "If that is what it takes." Melina regarded her for a long moment, then placed a hand on Alyssa's shoulder. "Then come tomorrow at dawn to the courtyard behind this hall. Wear simple clothes and bring no weapons. We will see if your soul is truly contrite." Dread coiled in Alyssa's gut. She forced herself to nod. "I understand." Melina's lips curved in something akin to a smile, though it was more chilling than comforting. "Good. The 7 guide your steps." With that, she turned away, leaving Alyssa to exit alone. The novices closed the doors once she was outside. She sucked in a shaky breath of night air. Whatever trial they had in mind, it would likely be no gentle affair. Still, this might be her best chance to peer deeper into the inner workings of the Sparrows, to see if she could find proof of the infiltration that could not be denied. She returned to the inn, her mind restless. Was she stepping into a snare? Possibly, but she could not turn back now. If she truly wanted answers, she had to risk it. Dawn broke with a chill wind. Alyssa woke early, dressed in her plainest garments. A simple woolen dress, her boots, and a cloak without her usual hood. She left her knife hidden under her mattress at the inn, though it pained her to go unarmed. Still, Melina had insisted no weapons be brought, and Alyssa had no desire to provoke the faith militant. She arrived at the courtyard behind the grain hall. It was enclosed by tall, sagging buildings. The morning sun barely penetrated, leaving the space in a cool shade. The smell of rotting hay and damp stone filled the air. A few novices were gathered, along with Melina. The brazier from the night before was lit once more, filling the courtyard with that pungent smoke. Melina beckoned her forward. "Annette, is it? You come seeking redemption?" Alyssa inclined her head. "Yes, Septa." Melina gestured to the novices. They approached Alyssa, circling around her. "This will be a test of your sincerity," Melina said, her voice calm yet commanding. "A test of your willingness to cast aside the foreign flame for the true flame of the 7. Alyssa swallowed. "What must I do?" One of the novices held out a wooden bowl. Inside it were small coals still glowing red. "Take one," Melina said. "Close your hand around it. Let the pain be your confession. If your faith is strong, the 7 will grant you the strength to endure." Alyssa stared at the coal, beads of sweat appearing at her temple despite the chill. This was exactly the type of ordeal she had heard about in the East, where worshippers of R'hllor tested their faith by holding hot irons or walking barefoot over flames. So the Sparrows had truly adopted such practices. But she had no choice. If she refused, they would brand her a heretic outright. So she steeled herself, reached into the bowl, and lifted a small glowing coal. The heat bit into her skin, and she clamped her jaw shut to keep from crying out. She shut her hand around the coal, pain lancing through her palm. "Recite the words," said Melina. "Say, I cast out the red god. I embrace the 7's cleansing fire. My sins be burned away." Alyssa's vision blurred as she forced the words through gritted teeth. "I cast out the red god. I embrace the 7's cleansing of fire. My sins be burned away." The heat grew unbearable. She felt her palm blistering, but she locked her gaze on Melina, refusing to drop the coal, praying that the novices would let her stop soon. At last, Melina nodded sharply. "Release." Alyssa opened her hand and let the coal drop back into the bowl. Her palm was red and raw, the skin seared. Tears sprang to her eyes unbidden. Melina nodded again, satisfaction glinting in her expression. "You have endured the test. The 7 see your willingness to suffer in penance. Do you deny them now?" Alyssa clutched her burned hand against her chest. "No," she whispered, the pain throbbing up her arm. "Good," Melina said. "Then your trial will continue. We shall provide you salve and bandages, enough to keep you from infection. But you will wear this burn as a mark of your devotion until it heals. As you pass through this day, remember each lance of pain as a reminder of the cost of sin." One novice stepped forward, gently leading Alyssa to a stool near the brazier. He pulled out a small jar of ointment and began to smear it over her palm. The sting made her wince, but she forced herself to remain still. When the novice finished bandaging her hand, Melina said, "Now you will atone further by performing tasks of charity and humility. Follow the novices. They will guide you." With that, Alyssa was put to work. The novices took her through the winding alleys of King's Landing, distributing stale bread to the starving, washing the feet of beggars, and preaching the word of the seven. All the while, her palm throbbed like a slow-burning ember. The novices barked orders at her, commanding her to kneel and pray in the mud, to share words of penance with passing strangers. She complied, heart pounding, forcing herself to maintain the facade. If she balked, they would turn on her. Yet despite the humiliations, she kept her eyes and ears open. She overheard novices speaking of secret gatherings, of men who once wore red robes but now served the faith. She caught snatches of conversation about how the High Sparrow was aware of certain reformed heretics in their ranks, but believed they proved that no one was beyond redemption. Some of these reformed souls had become fervent enforcers, punishing others with an almost sadistic glee. It seemed the infiltration was not hidden so much as tolerated, perhaps even admired. These men were living proof that the faith could convert the unbeliever. But as Alyssa suspected, they brought with them the intensity and cruelty of the Red God's teachings. By midday, she was exhausted. Her hand burned, her knees ached, and her stomach rumbled with hunger. The novices led her back to the courtyard behind the grain hall, where Melina waited. She regarded Alyssa with an approving nod. "You have done well. The fires of devotion are rekindling in your soul. Soon, we will see if you are worthy to join our cause." Alyssa forced herself to nod, though every instinct screamed that she had to leave. She needed no further proof. She already had more than enough to confirm that the Sparrows had co-opted aspects of Lawloress faith, or that Exarhiller devotees had co-opted the Sparrows, twisting the faith of the seven for their own ends. The question remained, what to do with that knowledge? King's Landing was too dangerous to openly spread such accusations. The High Sparrow's zeal was unstoppable as long as the small folk rallied behind him. That night, when the novices were distracted with chores, Alyssa managed to slip away. She clutched her bandaged hand against her chest, weaving through darkened alleys. She returned to her room, only to find a pair of novices waiting outside the door. They must have followed her or anticipated her flight. "Annette," said one, his tone dripping with disappointment. "You should have stayed. Are you trying to run from your penance?" She glanced around, seeing no immediate path of escape. "I am not running. I only came to fetch something." "Lies," the other novice said, face twisting with anger. "We saw how you looked today, like a rat caught in a trap. You do not truly serve the seven, do you?" Alyssa's heart hammered. If they attacked, she had no weapon on her. Her mind raced. She decided to feign indignation. "I have told no lies. I needed bandages for my burn." "Do not try to fool us," the first novice snapped. "Come quietly or we'll drag you." Before they could seize her, Alyssa stepped back, turning to run. But the novices were quick, and one lunged forward, catching her cloak. She twisted free, though the motion sent pain shooting through her burned hand. She stumbled, nearly losing her footing. The second novice aimed a punch at her, connecting with her rib. She gasped, doubling over. Through watering eyes, she saw a shape move in the shadows of the hallway. In an instant, that shape darted forward, seized one novice by the neck, and yanked him back with surprising strength. The novice yelped, losing his grip on Alyssa. The other novice whirled to face this new threat. She glimpsed a flash of steel. Before she could fully register what was happening, the novice cried out and slumped, a dagger in his side. "Come on," hissed the newcomer, grabbing Alyssa's arm. "We have to move." The stranger was a lean man with a weathered face, perhaps in his late 30s, wearing unassuming clothes but carrying a certain lethal grace. He pulled Alyssa past the wounded novice and out of the inn. She had no time to question him. They dashed into the night, weaving through narrow alleys until they were sure no one pursued. At last, the man stopped, panting. "Are you mad, woman? Taking up with the Sparrows?" Alyssa winced, clutching her burned hand. "I had reasons." He gave her a sharp look, clearly expecting an explanation. She assessed him. He moved with a practiced efficiency, yet wore no sigil that she could see. Possibly a mercenary, or a sellsword who despised the faith. "You saved my life," she managed. "I'm in your debt." He shook his head. "I've watched those zealots long enough to know an execution waiting to happen. That's not how I wanted this night to end." He nodded at her hand. "You need that tended properly." "My name is Alyssa," she said. "If you know a place we can hide." "Call me Rents," he replied. "I know a small safe house. This way." Despite her reservations about trusting a stranger, Alyssa had little choice. The faith militant might be out in force soon, hunting for her. She followed him through the labyrinth of King's Landing's poorest quarters. Eventually, they reached a modest structure with a rickety staircase. Inside, it smelled of damp and dust, but it was at least private. Rents lit a candle, then rummaged in a trunk until he found a rag and a waterskin. He motioned for her to sit. She sank onto a wooden stool while he gently unwrapped her bandage. The burn looked worse than she thought. Blisters had broken, leaving raw flesh. Rents hissed. "Damn, they made you hold hot coals, did they?" She nodded, tears welling at the corners of her eyes from a mixture of pain and exhaustion. "They call it a test of faith." He cleaned the wound with water, trying to be as gentle as possible. Alyssa bit back cries, her body shaking from the stinging sensation. "I have no proper salve here," Rents muttered. "But this will have to do." He tore a strip from a relatively clean cloth and bound her hand anew. When he was finished, Alyssa exhaled, her face clammy with sweat. "Thank you," she managed. He nodded curtly. "So tell me, what's your game? Why risk the Sparrow's wrath? You're no devout penitent. I can see that." Alyssa hesitated, then decided that honesty might serve better than half-truths. She explained, in broad strokes, how she came to the city seeking answers about lawless infiltration into the faith, how she suspected some of the Sparrows had arisen from a lost devotion to the Lord of Light. She spoke of the changes in the faith's teachings, the cruelty, the adoption of foreign rites. She recounted what she'd overheard in the stable. Rents listened intently, his expression grim. When she finished, he let out a soft whistle. "I suspected as much, though I've never heard it so plainly. I've seen men from the east skulking around with these so-called holy folk. They vanish before the dawn. All the while, the High Sparrow rages about foreign corruption, never suspecting the seeds might be in his own garden. Or maybe he doesn't care. Maybe he thinks it's useful, so long as it keeps the small folk in line." Alyssa nodded. "I fear that's the truth of it, or that the movement has taken on a life of its own, with or without his knowledge." Rents leaned back against the wall, arms folded. "So, what do you plan to do now?" She grimaced. "Leave the city if I can. There's no point staying. I have the proof I need. The question is, what good does it do me? Who can I tell?" He arched a brow. "Who would believe you? The lords fear the Sparrows, the small folk revere them, and the crown's power is tenuous at best. I doubt you'll find a warm welcome proclaiming that the faith has been corrupted by foreign zealots." Alyssa sighed. "I know. I came to find closure about my father's obsession, but I found something bigger and worse." Rents studied her for a moment, then shrugged. "Sometimes just knowing the truth is the only victory you get. But if you're set on leaving, do it soon. Once they discover that novice you wounded, they'll be out for blood. Or they'll throw you in a cell and call you a heretic." Alyssa nodded, heart heavy. "You're right. I'll go at first light if I can. Will you help me slip past the gates?" A slight smile curved on Rents's lips. "I might, but I'm no friend to the faith, and that means they keep an eye out for me as well. Still, there's a smuggler I know who might ferry you across the Blackwater." Her eyes flickered with relief. "Thank you. I don't know how to repay you." He shrugged again, looking away. "Don't thank me yet. This city's a pit of vipers. We might still run into trouble." Alyssa stood. Pain flared in her bandaged hand, but she forced herself upright. "We can't stay here long. If the Novi CS tracked me once, they might do so again." He nodded, dousing the candle. "Then let's go before night's end. The smuggler usually runs his boat near the quays by the Blackwater Rush." They exited into the moonlit streets. The damp breeze carried the smell of the river, mingled with the city's stench of refuse and rotting fish. Though it was late, random pockets of life still stirred. Whores soliciting last customers, a handful of drunken men squabbling by a tavern. The ever-present watchful novices of the faith militant were less visible at this hour, though Alyssa was sure they had roving patrols. Rents led her through back alleys, avoiding main thoroughfares. Twice, they had to duck into doorways as they heard the clatter of approaching footsteps, be it city watch or faith militant. Once, they saw a ragged figure being dragged by two robed men, but from the other side of the street, they could not interfere without risking their own capture. Eventually, they reached the quays. A thick fog drifted over the river, obscuring the moonlight. A few lanterns glimmered in the distance, marking ships at anchor. Rents guided her to a small wharf where a single boat bobbed gently. A shadowy figure stood on the plank, humming softly. "That's him," Rents whispered. "Let me talk to him first." They approached, and Rents exchanged a few low words with the smuggler, a wiry man missing 3 fingers on his left hand. The smuggler eyed Alyssa suspiciously, but at length nodded. Rents turned back to her. "He'll take you downstream, away from the city. You can slip ashore where you wish." Alyssa's voice wavered with gratitude. "I thank you, truly. If you ever need aid." He shook his head. "Get far from this place. That's thanks enough." She nodded, stepping onto the boat. Her burned hand throbbed as she gripped the railing. She turned back one last time to meet Rents's gaze. He gave a brief nod, then vanished into the fog, returning to the city that had become a battlefield of souls. The smuggler cast off, guiding the boat into the black waters of the river. Alyssa sat near the stern, clutching her cloak around her. She stared back at the receding lights of King's Landing, heart-racked by a tumult of emotions. Relief at escaping, guilt over those left behind, anger at the cruelty she had witnessed, and dread at what might come next. She had the answers she sought, in a sense. Yes, the Sparrows had indeed arisen, at least in part, from a lost faith in Lawler. They had twisted belief for political gain. Some of them knowingly, others perhaps unwittingly, entangled in a new brand of fanaticism. What she did with that knowledge was uncertain. Perhaps she would find a way to warn the lords of the realm, or perhaps she would carry it as a burden for the rest of her days. As the boat drifted downriver, she turned the ruby ring on her finger one last time. Its surface caught a glimmer of starlight, but the gem felt cold against her skin. She closed her eyes, picturing her father's face. If he had harbored hopes that the Lord of Light might restore House Haraway, those hopes had died with him. Now a new force threatened to reshape the realm, fed by the same relentless belief in fire and purification. Yet behind the smoke and fervor, men still schemed for power. Faith, it seemed, was but another weapon in their arsenal. The boat drifted into the swirling fog, carrying her away from King's Landing. Above, the moon floated silver-white in a sky that promised no immediate salvation. Alyssa's fate lay beyond these waters, but she could not forget what she had seen, nor the fire she had endured. If there was any justice in the realm, perhaps one day it would cast light on the deception that lurked in the faith's new fervor, and the flames would devour those who had used them to harm the innocent. But for now, only darkness and the faint hope of survival lay ahead. She opened her eyes to stare at the ripples of the river, determined not to let the water's gloom pull her under. She would live. She would bear witness. And maybe, in time, the truth would find its way into the open. The Lord of Light, the Seven, the old gods. It mattered little which name men gave their deity if they twisted the faith to their own ends. In the hush of the night, only one certainty lingered. Faith could be as deadly as any sword when wielded by those who saw only the flames, never the light within them. The boat slipped past the outskirts of the city, the distant glow of torches receding into the night. Alyssa bowed her head. She thought of the countless souls who would remain behind, caught in a web of zealotry spun from 2 worlds. Perhaps one day, they would discover that the men who claimed to speak for the Seven had, in truth, carried a shadow of the Eastern fire in their hearts. By then, it might be too late to stop the conflagration they would unleash. But for now, There was only the hush of the river and the quiet beat of her heart, reminding her she was still alive, still free. The burned flesh on her palm ached, a reminder that faith, when tainted by ambition, could brand its mark upon anyone. Alyssa Haraway closed her eyes, letting the gentle sway of the boat lull her weary spirit. She had her answer. Whether it would save or doom the realm remained to be seen. She would not forget the face of the Septon, the ring of novices, or the cryptic figures from the east. She would remember the words of the woman named Etta, the stooped beggar who recognized a former red priest beneath a sparrow's robes. The last flickering lights of the city disappeared behind a bend in the river, and the water stretched away into a deeper darkness. Alyssa felt the night air stroke her face. She let out a slow breath, tasting freedom and uncertainty all at once. In the midst of so much darkness, she clung to the small flame of her resolve, a flame she alone controlled. The illusions of men might twist any faith into a weapon, but as long as a single soul remembered the truth, hope endured. No matter how fiercely the Sparrows claimed to champion the Seven, no matter how they harnessed the rhetoric of R'hllor to seize power, there would be those who saw through the ruse. There would be those who remembered the gentle grace of the Seven as it was meant to be, free from cruelty. There would be those who recalled the genuine warmth of a red priest's flame, unshackled by politics. Perhaps, in time, these memories would shape a new understanding, bridging faiths without corrupting them. But that day was far off, and Alyssa had roads yet to walk. She gazed at the black horizon, her breath steady, her thoughts her own. Though the city behind her seethed with holy fire, she clutched a spark of her own, an honest desire for truth untainted by cruelty. And as the boat drifted on, she carried that spark away from the broken illusions of a land where two faiths had collided, forging a new instrument of power. In the quiet swirl of the current, Alyssa Haraway vowed that she would not let her father's fate, nor the fate of countless innocents, be forgotten. She would keep searching, listening for any rumor of a power strong enough to stand against unbridled fanaticism. Whether that power came from steel, from cunning, or from a gentler faith altogether, she did not know. All she knew was that in the contest between light and darkness, men too often mistook the heat of their own ambitions for divine fire, and that mistake could sunder kingdoms. So she left King's Landing with the knowledge that the Sparrows, in part, had indeed sprung from a lost faith in R'hllor, that their zeal was not as pure as they proclaimed. And she carried the hope, distant and faint as a star in a storm, that someday the truth would rise like dawn, dispelling shadows. Until then, the realm would burn with a cold, cruel flame, fueled by pride and the cunning of those who whispered in the High Sparrow's ear. And the question of who truly guided the flame, R'hllor or the Seven, might matter little, for the innocent felt the heat of the fire all the same. Still, as the night closed around her and the boat drifted ever onward, Alyssa did not pray. She simply breathed, hand throbbing in time with her heartbeat, and waited for the morning light to break across the horizon. If the gods were watching, if they heard the pleas of the desperate, she hoped they would show mercy. But she had learned too well that mortals must often wrest mercy from the jaws of zeal, shaping their own destiny in a world where faith could be as fierce and as fickle as any storm. And so the city vanished behind her, a smudge of faint glow on the dark water, leaving her with little more than memories of hot coal burning her flesh and the haunting revelation of how easily faith could be twisted. She turned her face to the unseen distance, letting the night wind cool her brow, resolute in her will to endure. The smuggler, silent at the oars, guided her onward, bearing her away from one crucible into the unknown. In that unknown, perhaps, she might find the fragile seed of a different life, one where she was no longer bound by the ghosts of her father's past, or the suffocating threat of a zealotry that burned in the name of a god it hardly knew. Thus, the question lingered in her mind, echoing across the dark water. Did the Sparrows arise from a lost faith in R'hllor, twisting belief for political gain? She had seen enough to know the answer was yes, though such knowledge was dangerous and, in the eyes of many, heretical. But she would carry it anyway, as a shield against the illusions of zealots. The truth, however perilous, was the one light she trusted, shining quietly in the recesses of her soul. And sometimes, in a world full of deception, a single light of truth was all one had.